Welcome to today's Nonprofit Net Zoominar. Are you ready to build a culture of racial equity, diversity, and inclusion? I'm Dennis Boyer, president of the Nonprofit Net Board of Directors. Our Zoominars are open to everyone without charge. We do incur costs to bring them to you, though, so we hope you'll consider supporting Nonprofit Net. And since this is NPN's 20th anniversary year, we're suggesting a $20 donation. That's, of course, voluntary. We need your support, though, to keep the Zoominars coming your way. So we're going to send you a link to our donation page. Also, we'd appreciate your feedback on today's Zoominar. It helps us to plan future sessions, and it's very valuable to our speakers as well. So with the donation link, we'll also send you a survey link. And now, on to today's presentation. Our speaker, Carlos Hoyt. Carlos is among many distinctions and designations, a licensed clinical social worker and a PhD in social work. He consults and trains on social identity, social bias, and social justice for numerous educational institutions, nonprofits, a U.S. government department, and other organizations. Anybody who wants to optimize their inclusivity efforts and outcomes. Now that's a mouthful, but wait, you'll see I'm right. Carlos, welcome.
Thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you so much, Dora, for making this a very smooth operation. It's only the technical and organizational stuff that makes me look good, so I appreciate all of that. And to those of you who are attending, it's really an honor. First of all, thank you for doing work in the nonprofit sector. I know from a lifetime of doing that kind of work that it can be really rewarding and it can be really challenging. So thank you for being in it and staying at it. I sincerely hope that what we will cover today will be useful to you in one way or another. And I know we only have a short amount of time, so I'll get right into the content with the hope that I'll be able to sort of set the table, for some good questions and conversation towards the end of the presentation. And I'll try to leave as much time as possible for that. Dennis and Dora and I myself will be trying to keep track of the questions and comments that come in so that we can really jump into them as we near the end. So with that in mind, the title, as Dennis said, are you ready to build a culture of racial equity, diversity, and inclusion? My guess is that you always are in terms of intention, but then there are a lot of challenges on the way. So if someone were to ask you after this presentation, like, what basically was it about? Give me the thumbnail, give me the elevator. I would be very happy if you were able to say to those folks that, Carlos basically said that in monitoring and whether or not we're doing a good job fostering and maintaining an inclusive environment, there are two questions that need to drive us. One is, does this group represent significant human diversity? Any group, whether it's a classroom or a boardroom or a family group, the group of people that we are engaged with, is there real significant diversity in it? The second question being, are effective equity and inclusion practices in place to activate the benefits of diversity? And those are very key things. And obviously you see our terms, diversity, equity, and inclusion in those two questions. That's basically going to be our constellation of North Star, for moving towards an inclusive environment. In terms of, what I hope I'm trying to do when I work with folks is sort of metaphored in this image. That is a grist mill, for those of you who might not be familiar. And a grist mill is where grist gets ground down into something that then can be used, based on the needs of the user. I recognize that every single one of us has our own interior sort of capacity and way to make sense of the world, to synthesize things, and then to put it into praxis, praxis, to do something with it. I try very hard to stay away from sounding as if I am prescribing with a capital P, or saying that this is absolutely required, otherwise this won't happen. There are some cases where I think that's relevant, especially around issues having to do with safety and critical thinking and just clear understanding of things. But I talk a lot about my work being about building capacity, not being the capacity for anybody, because the work has to come through you authentically. So as you receive, what I'm offering, I hope you'll think about yourself as a mill that has every right to mill all the grain, that I'm going to offer to you today. And we'll see what comes out of it. But your synthesis, your metabolysis of all of it is what matters to me. I would love for you to keep a few things in mind. Also, as you take in this material that you will grind. One is to try to consider everything that I'm sharing with you from 3 different levels, and then with one thing in mind, and that's where the praxis comes in. So the micro level, and by that, all I mean is your personal perspective on and experience with whatever topic we're covering, right? What does it mean to you personally? The meso level, how does a topic manifest in the context of your subgroups and communities? So this might be your department, it might be your executive committee if you're an executive, it might be your community where you live, it might be the larger institution that houses or takes care of or monitors or regulates the work that you do in your organization. And then the macro level, how is this topic shaped, governed, policed, etc., at the societal and institutional level? Few of us have the power, the capacity to actually change the big macros in life, but probably all of us are touched by them. So it's important to factor in what's going on societally right now. And we certainly know, that in terms of what we call DEI these days, there's a whole lot going on at the societal and the political level that certainly has a bearing on our work, whether it's near or far. And then finally, as you consider things from the micro, the meso, and the macro levels, what is your praxis? What's the translation of whatever learning you might do today and the experience that we'll have today into deliberate actions that you want to take? Praxis means to do something with the stuff that you have. And I always say to folks that this work is only worthwhile if it leads to a reduction, in social bias. So please be thinking about praxis. There are a few definitions that I hope we'll keep in mind. And if you don't have it yet, you'll get a link to a PDF of all the slides I have now. So that, for example, on this page, after I walk through definitions and move on to a different slide, if you want to go back and look at those definitions, please feel free. The only thing I'd ask is that you not ask a question about a slide that we haven't yet covered, for those of you who are advanced sort of slide movers. But beyond that, I want you to be able to move through the slides, make them bigger or smaller, whatever is best for you as I move through them as well. So 3 definitions I offer you in terms of being ready to have an inclusive environment. And they are of 3 terms called social identity, social bias, and social justice. By social identity, all I mean is the groups we identify with, groups others think we're part of, and groups we think others are part of as well. They include ethnicity, physical appearance, age, ability, gender, sexual orientation, race or racialization, social status, and worldview/belief system or ideology. So how a person identifies does not always match how others identify them, and that's a key aspect of social identity. For example, as we know, particularly in these days of heightened gender identity awareness, sometimes we can perceive somebody who we think, optically looks like what we might think is a female, but we need to hold back on our assumptions and check them before we go ahead and run with them, because that person might not identify the way we think they might identify. And the last thing I'll say about social identity is that it's distinct from personal identity. And the gender example sort of illustrates that. There are social markers, that we might consider normal around what a person, for example, like me, looks like and what it means about where I'm from. And certainly when I came to this country from Costa Rica, when I was 3-4 years old, I was immediately sort of slotted into the African-American Black category, which one might say is or isn't right for me. But what wasn't visible to folks is that I was born in Costa Rica, which brings a whole different set of aspects to my identity. So that's social identity. Social bias then refers to attitudes or actions that result in advantages or disadvantages for people based on their perceived membership in a social identity group. And we have the list of isms, that go along with social identities, and we'll cover them again in a different way later. When I'm working with little kids and I'm trying to explain bias, I put up an image of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and I say that all bias means is that you're leaning in a direction, right? You're not straight up and down the middle, you're leaning one way or the other. And if you're leaning towards something, that means you're leaning away from something else. And the things you're leaning towards, let's say that's where the privilege is and the advantage is. And the things you're leaning against, that's where the disadvantage is. And when that happens socially, usually, people get hurt on one side of it, and then people get goodies that they don't deserve on the other side. And that's social bias. And then finally, for this trio, social justice, which refers to conditions in which everyone is treated as fairly as possible regarding basic human needs such as safety, security, health and wellness, education, employment, and you see the rest of the list there that you could continue for yourself. When I talk about DEI, I use these three terms interchangeably with DEI because I think they are the heart or the crux of what's really at play. We all have social identities, and that means, sadly, that we're all susceptible to being treated with social bias, but it also means that we're all, I hope, empowered and motivated to increase social justice. Goals for today with those things in mind, and you see 1 and 6 here, and I'll fill in the others in a moment. I hope to provide an opportunity for you to clarify your bearings on the interplay between the three things we just talked about: social identity, social bias, and social justice. At the end, I want to have some robust Q&A. And in between, there's some grist, that I want you to have to mill. I want to introduce a unified and unifying framework for understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion. One of the things that's, I think, really interesting about DEI is that it really hasn't been around for a long time, certainly not long enough to have a capital P paradigm, or solidified set of ethics or procedures that have been tested, over the years. There's more and more evidence-based practice out there, which is wonderful. But DEI needs a unifying framework. And in my work, I try to offer where I am at with that these days for your own consumption and synthesis. I want to give us a chance to refine DEI conceptualization itself and some of the language that's used currently to achieve diversity without divisiveness and to achieve true inclusivity. And I will say when we get to that part, that I actually would recommend that folks think about the language that we are using right now, and is it really the best language? I want to talk a little bit about creating a shared commitment among staff or teams in order to promote and embody anti-bias culture with humility, candor, and empathy. And consider ways to continually monitor a sense of belonging in our groups at all levels and all constituencies. All right, so if you have your PDF and this looks a little bit small to you on the screen, 1, don't worry, I'm going to show you a bigger view of this. And 2, you can also use your PDF to go through it in whatever way is best for you. Because we're not having a full out discussion, which I would love throughout this whole thing, I don't think, we'll have much need to monitor our participation, but I do like to share this with folks just as a tool to use in priming good constructive engagement for DEI conversations. So with that, I'm going to be quiet for a moment, and I'm going to show you the first half of this blown up a little bit. Then I'll show you the bottom half of it and give you a chance to think about that and write any questions that you might want to ask about it when we get to the discussion. So, and if you're not catching the little thing up top here, this head with a beer in it, that's my best attempt at humor. It says, please bear in mind. I hope you get that. I can't hear you laughing, but I'm sure you're roaring on your side of the screen. So without any further ado, some primers for constructive interaction. I'll be quiet for a moment and read these through myself and assume that when I'm done, you've had a chance to look at it too. All right, I'll switch to the second half, again, knowing that you can take your own time with your PDF if you'd like to. So this is the bottom half of the same primer page. All right, I'll advance. So in terms of introducing a unified and unifying framework for understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'd love to introduce you to what I call the social identity prism. In terms of backstory, I've probably been working on this for a couple of decades now. And this is the stage that it's at right now. It's likely to change as time goes by because based on my experience in working with people, sometimes folks actually talk to me directly and they say, wow, Carlos, I wonder how this would be if you did this or that. And sometimes that actually makes its way into the next iteration of this. But for now, I'd love for you to take a look at this. It basically has 4 parts. Here on the left side, you see a prism figure, and coming through the figure is a sort of a human beam of light, which represents all of humanity, including you and me. And the prism idea here is that our humanity, our personhood, gets refracted, right? It gets split, just as a prism splits light, resulting in the typical social identity categories that really play out in most societies, but certainly in North American society and European society as well, that most of us spend time in. So let's understand that, that as human beings, we are conditioned to, and we are expected to, and then we sort of expect ourselves to see others and ourselves as members of family, ethnicity, and heritage groups, physical appearance groups, age groups, ability groups, gender groups, sexual orientation groups, racialization groups. And if that word is new to you, don't worry, I'm going to provide a bit of an explanation soon. Social status groups, worldview and ideology groups. And I always add the plus sign there in case this list doesn't capture what's most important for somebody, and that invites then a conversation and perhaps an expansion of what's in the prism. The next part of this is the explanation that comes to the right. Our brains tend to sort, simplify, and rank everything, including personhood. This or that, good or bad, us or them. It's hard for us to hold the multiple intersecting aspects of personhood at once in our minds. Instead, much like a prism, we often refract or split off our complex whole selves into narrow categories. Recognizing the full spectrum of social identity and trying to resist the tendency to reduce people to one or another restrictive category enables us to think critically and inclusively, engage empathically, reduce social bias, and thrive in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. And I'll try to emphasize something about this explanation. One, it's not partisan. It's not sort of politically driven in any way. It is a statement about human psychology in a very universal way. It's about all of us. It's not about those bad folks who are doing this to these folks or the victims of all of that. It's about the human brain and some of its tendencies that we all share, and how we were all socialized then to sort of reify some of those tendencies in ways that can be super positive, in terms of feeling good about your social identity, but that can at the same time serve as the basis for social bias. The third part of what's on the sheet are some, I hope, handy dandy definitions. And I put them right on the sheet instead of in a different place, because one of the things that can confound us in terms of moving towards an inclusive environment is that we all don't necessarily have the same meaning for the really important terms that we're using. So I really implore folks who are pursuing inclusivity to take the time to build your glossary. So when your organization talks about ability, what does that mean? When your organization uses the term gender, are we talking about the binary? Are we talking about a full spectrum? Do we have a definition for what trans means? Do we have training around that, et cetera, et cetera? So that's what these are here for. And then the final part, and perhaps the most important part of the social identity prism framework, is the thing I'm circling here. This is the upshot, this is the end product, this is the goal, that whoever you are, however you are, you should feel safe here. If we have said that you have the qualifications to be a member of our community, then you should feel every bit as safe as the person in the highest seat, the person with the most whatever, because you're a member of the community. So I offer the social identity prism as a key sort of foundation stone for beginning to think about what DEI is really all about in terms of understanding in a conceptually inclusive way. So again, taking it into its parts, we have the prism idea, how we are trained to and inclined to put things in categories and hierarchy. Now, I do want to take a moment and sort of talk about this racialization term that I'm using. So the arc of discussion about race, racial identity, racism is moving sort of shakily, away from the idea that race has some sort of scientific substrate, that there's something genetically, biologically different about human beings in terms of the categories that we call race. And I'm sure there's some people on the call, I hope most people on the call are very familiar with the fact that we've moved past that. We get it, there's nothing genetic, there's nothing material, there's nothing substantive about the idea of dividing people by race. As a matter of fact, it's a bad idea empirically, and yet we continue to do it. The process by which that happens is called racialization, not a term that I made up, one that I discovered a long time ago in doing some research, one that I've modified a little bit for my purposes, and this is basically what it means to say. The process of racialization has 5 steps to it. One is selecting some arbitrary, superficial, visible marker to distinguish some humans from some other humans. And with race, you know what those things are, and I'll talk about these more in just a moment. But it really could be anything. When I am having fun with young people, I ask them to create a race based on some superficial marker. Sometimes I'll say eyebrows. Sometimes I'll say whether your earlobes are attached or not attached. Sometimes I'll say height, which can be a lot of fun. And I say that, one, to keep things a little bit light, but also to really ignite critical thinking about what it is we're doing when we put people into these rough categories. So the first step is just selecting the marker. Second step then is logically sorting people into subgroups based on those markers. When it comes to race, at least in the black-white binary, darker people over here, lighter skinned people over there. And then things start to get tricky and problematic if they weren't already, because then the human brain tends to attribute invisible positive or negative characteristics to the qualities that are visible, that go with those subgroups. So we start to create false concordances. That is, if you have this, then you must have that as well. And if that weren't bad enough, then in the case of race, we essentialize and eternalize those differences. We say that the differences that you have between you and those other people of that race, you can't change those. No matter how hard you try, you can't become a member of that racial tribe because they're hereditary, they're inborn, you're going to pass them on to your the people that you make coming after you, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, we won't take a deep dive into this now, but there was good, by which I mean convenient, diabolical reason for that. That's what kept the slave trade going, that you are a slave forever and ever. And then finally, steps 1 through 4 sort of serve as a very false, and pernicious, but powerful rationale for acting on this false logic, right? So we act on this absurd and lethal logic as justification for the interpersonal, structural, systemic, and institutional advantaging and disadvantaging of people in so-called races. So that's what racialization is. I have a book that talks about this a little bit, but if you want the short version, I have a 17.5-minute TEDx talk that also goes into racialization. But it is a term that I use, so I always want to pause and make sure that folks know what it is I'm talking about when I use that term. And I do promote that we start to shift from talking about people as members of races, because races don't really exist, and instead as racialized people with real impact socially. And I welcome your questions about that when we get to the question and answer. And just for your information, this is what the worksheet actually looks like when I do it with kids. So imagine, that we are talking about trying to make a race using height. Kids have to decide, well, what is the marker? Is it over 6 feet, under 6 feet? What if one of your parents is tall and one of your parents is short? Is that the parallel to people who are biracial? It gets very interesting very fast for young philosophers. And I hope it might for us older philosophers as well. So the other side of the prism then, we're sort of working through it with racialization as an example. And again, all of these categories that we tend to divide people into, they all come with some positives. You can take great pride in some of the aspects of your social identity, but they also, are attached to biases. And here they are, things that we all walk through. Sometimes we're on the receiving end of these things, and sometimes, if we're going to be honest, we're the ones who are bringing, the bias. But the awareness of it is what matters, because that's what's going to help us keep it in check. And then finally, as I said, this is the upshot that we're all shooting for. A companion to the social identity prism is what I call the cauldron of social bias. And you see I've written beneath there but for a change of circumstance go I, which has an echo of a phrase many of you are probably familiar with, which is there but for the grace of God go I. But I'm trying to keep it secular for our purposes. And the idea here is that, right now, and maybe for always, we have done and do social justice in terms of social identity politics. If my group is under fire, then I'm going to go out to the rally. We're going to advocate and lobby for rights for our group. And maybe that's the best we can do. If your group is facing something and I don't share that group, then I wish you good luck, but I might not be showing up for you. So let me show you what I wish for, as a better model for social justice. So the big cauldron that you see here represents social bias, no matter how it expresses itself. Every ism is a version of the human tendency to reduce complicated beings to members of narrow, essentialized social identity groups, as we saw in the prism, to rank the constructed groups as better or worse in various ways, and to favor or disfavor perceived members accordingly. So every little cauldron that you see here is simply here to represent any given social identity category in terms of the bias that can be poured into it. But you'll notice that the color of the toxic material is perfectly the same from one to the next. It's only the form that it takes that changes. I promote that this understanding makes real and effective allyship possible and allows us to act in coalition instead of competition. And I'll just read what it says on the bottom here. By seeing past the confines of reductive, essentialized social identities and realizing that bias is bias, no matter how it manifests, we are able to respond to any and all forms of bias against any and all social identity groups as variations of a single sickness called social bias, and act in powerful coalition instead of as separate groups of people who must keep to their own and only look out for themselves. So I welcome your questions and thoughts about that and how to use this in your own work when we get to that part of the program. Creating a shared commitment among staff or your team in order to promote and embody anti-bias culture with humility, candor, and empathy. And I don't have a red circle to put around it here. Sometimes I do that with my slides, but I will call your attention to anti-bias culture. You'll hear me use the word anti-bias quite a bit. And it's not as uncommon a term as racialization is right now, but typically these days, you'd probably see anti-racism in there. And I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily, but we'll talk about why I tend towards anti-bias instead of some other more narrowly focused anti-terms. So how might we create a shared commitment among staff in order to promote and embody anti-bias culture? There are many ways, obviously, but because we had an hour, I wanted to show one thing that has proven to be a very powerful sort of tool in this effort. And I call this the DEI Ally Pact. And I'm going to read it through for you, or most of it anyway. And then again, you have it in your PDF for you to dwell on at whatever pace is best for you. My Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Ally Pact. And it's basically made up of 4 parts. And they are things that we are owning. I was going to say confessing, but owning as true about ourselves. So speaking for myself, Carlos Hoyt, I know I have blind spots. That means the inability to see that what I'm doing might be harmful to someone. I know I have tough spots. The natural resistance to input that suggests my behavior conflicts with my intention. So not only might I not be able to see something, but it might be hard for me to receive your news that I'm not seeing something. I know I have blank spots, a lack of data and knowledge about crucial differences in social advantages and disadvantages between myself and others. It is undoubtedly true that as the world and communities and workplaces get more and more diverse, it is literally impossible to know everything about everybody, that we might be coming in contact with. We have blank spots, not an excuse, but a truth. And finally, I know I have work to do. And I promise to do the work I need to do to see my biases, spare you my defensiveness, and educate myself in order to be the most effective, you can fill in the blank here, in a way that fits your organization, that I can be. I hope you will always feel entitled to let me know if my blind, tough, or blank spots ever cause you to feel anything less than respected, included, and well served by me. I promise to always do my best to receive your notice of my mistakes with humility and gratitude. I have shared this in many a community now, and it's really wonderful to see how consistently well received this is, and then how people actually act on it. And the easiest way is to see it on people's doors or made into a poster, et cetera. But I love to ask folks, yeah, beyond that, what's happening with this? And then when I hear the stories of someone inviting a conversation about them feeling like they put their foot in it, or feeling that something they saw between two people, maybe represented a blind spot or something, and then referring back to this as license, to ask somebody their consent to talk about this. So, my friend, that ally pact we have, is it okay if I talk to you about something that I noticed the other day? Very few people approach that way will say, no, don't talk to me. Usually you'll get a yes, and then we're rolling. And the conversation might be a little bit tricky, but at least we're having it. So I offer the DEI Ally Pact as a way to help a team really move in a contract almost kind of way, in a strong agreement kind of way towards inclusivity, even if it means some difficult conversations here and there. What are ways to continually monitor a sense of belonging? There are many, many ways, and I'm going to talk to you about one of my favorite in a moment, if your work and time is sort of conducive to this kind of thing. But I'll give you a couple of examples before we go over this one. I worked at a school where one of the school mottos was honoring differences. And I just think that's a lovely school motto and aspiration. And while I was there, we created something called the Honoring Differences channel. And what the Honoring Differences channel was simply an open survey where anybody, any student or their parent could send a note to me in my role as the DEI director to let me know about one of two things. They could send me a report of thriving, THRIV, et cetera. And that would mean that a teacher in the community was doing something that made them feel a great sense of belonging and recognized, et cetera. So I might get a thriving note that said that today we had a discussion on gender, and the teacher really did such a nice job, explaining that it's not just two genders in the world, and it made me feel seen and affirmed. And that's a wonderful report to get. Or the report could be on striving, STRIV, et cetera. And that might be something that goes something like, well, a teacher, call me by the wrong name for the fourth time this week. And it's just because there are only two of us who look like this, and it makes me feel like I'm not being seen. In both cases, the Honoring Differences channel was not a dead letter office. We were going to do something with this. The teachers knew it, the kids knew it. So I would talk with the students and or their parents, if that was in order, to figure out, oh, what are we going to do now? Do you want to talk to the teacher? I think you have a pretty good relationship with them. Or do you want me to talk to them first? But I always remind the students, your teacher wants this information, even if it's a little bit critical, because they're not perfect people. That's why we have our DEI Ally Pact, and they want to get better at taking care of you. So that's a way of sort of constantly inviting people to let you know how they're doing. In addition to that, there are many organizations that will do a periodic assessment. It looks more like a survey that goes out periodically. And I always say it's a mix of these things, that really make it possible for folks to know that we mean business when we want to make sure that they feel included. One wonderful way to go about it is an appreciative inquiry approach, and that's what these 4 spheres recommend or represent. So an appreciative inquiry model of inviting people to talk about anything, to tell you the truth, but right now let's talk about DEI and inclusivity, would involve a discovery sort of phase where we invite people to say what's going on that's good, right? In this stage, participants explore and discover the best of what is already present in the organization or community. And as a social worker, I guess, or maybe as an optimist or as a psychotherapist, I think the strength is always the best place to start. So why not start there? And this includes identifying the strengths, values, and successes that have contributed to its past successes. What do we do well in terms of DEI, basically, is the question here. Or as I, was interviewing our 3 and 4-year-olds when I was at my last school, what is it about our school that makes you feel really happy to be here and like you belong? And then we hear just some wonderful things about some wonderful people and peers, et cetera. After the discovery phase, the next step would be the dream phase. All right, then in this stage, let's imagine and envision a future state that builds on the strengths and successes identified in the discovery stage. Identify the desired outcomes and goals and create a shared vision for the future, right? And nobody says we have to do these things, but boy, if there weren't any restrictions, what would make this a perfect place for you to feel like you belong? That then leads quite naturally to, all right, can we design any of these things that we think would really help to make us even stronger? So identify specific actions that will need to be taken, the resources required, and here we get to stress test some of our ideas in the dream phase to see what we can really do. What do we have the resources for? What do we prioritize for now, et cetera? And then obviously to deliver, to put those things in place. And then the cycle just repeats because whatever we put in place is probably not going to be perfect. So we'll have to keep sort of monitoring that as well. There's great literature on appreciative inquiry approaches to evaluation and improvement. And it's one that I think is really well suited for DEI processes. Refining DEI conceptualization and language to achieve diversity without divisiveness and to achieve true inclusivity. As I've been talking, I wonder, these four things. And I'm titling this A Necessary Heresy because I realize that some of the ways I tend to talk about DEI, and particularly race and racialization and all that, aren't necessarily what might be called the orthodoxy right now. But change sometimes comes through heresy, and sometimes heresy is the best way to move something forward. So I wonder, number one, what are you seeing and hearing in the way I present this stuff and the content itself that's new to your DEI thinking? And on the right here, there are some frames, some terms that I've been using, and I want you to keep them in mind. Number two, which conceptual and language staples and standards of DEI orthodoxy are you not seeing and hearing as I present this content? Number three, what are you feeling and thinking regarding what you see and hear and what you don't see and hear, vis-a-vis what you're used to in terms of DEI talk? And number four, what might you do, capital letters, with these alternative ways of framing DEI knowledge and practice? So again, the list on the right, you've heard me use terms like frameworks. Does that come up in your work? Social identity, social bias, and social justice are those terms that are common in your practice. Anti-bias, and here, now thinking back to the prison, one of the almost predictable complications, I wouldn't even call it a drawback, in prioritizing terms like anti-racism, which obviously I am not against, I hope that goes without saying, is that sadly, because of our human psychological architecture, it tends to invite the question, what about me, right? What about my group? Why are we only talking about that all the time? And obviously there's good reason. The house that's on fire in front of us most of the time probably should get a bit more water than houses that aren't on fire. Nevertheless, the human mind is what it is. And I find and I believe, that going back to the coalitional approach that I was talking about earlier, no one resists the term anti-bias. Social bias is not a good thing, and most people don't want to be perpetrators of it, whatever group is in the target. So anti-bias subsumes anti-racism, anti-homophobia or heterosexism, anti-gender bias, right down the line. Shouldn't our organization aim to be that kind of organization, an anti-bias organization? So I offer that to you as a rationale for how we language these things. Racialization, as I said earlier, I won't go into that anymore now. I'm happy to go into it more when we have time for questions. Coalitionism, we've talked about. I may have mentioned empathy once. I put it on my list because it is a huge piece of the work that I do when it comes to DEI stuff. And we don't tend to talk about empathy a whole lot in DEI, I notice. The idea of having a pact, like the DEI pact, between all the folks who work together, adults and students, can be a really powerful thing for an organization. And finally, belonging has emerged, as a term, not just of art, but a term of research, like the news is in. When folks feel that they have a sense of belonging, lots of great things flow from that, from productivity to academic achievement if we're in a school, to working better with other groups, to even just well-being. So there's good reason to be adopting and understanding some of this terminology in your attempts to really be ready to create an inclusive environment. All right, we have roughly 15 minutes. I hope that's going to be good enough for Q&A and discussion. I am happy to go back to any slides that we've had before. But before we do that, well, as a means of doing some Q&A, I actually want to give some brief answers to some questions that were offered when you folks signed up for this. So thank you for those of you who took the time to ask some questions. I'll move through these as clearly, but also as quickly as I can, and then open it up for folks who have questions right now in this moment. So some of the questions that were asked or comments that were made. I have tried to create an organizational culture that upholds differences as an asset and avoids performative DEI actions. This is challenging. That is an understatement, I'm sure, for all of those of us who try to do this on a regular basis. So I highlighted the term performative here. And obviously, I'm not in the head of the person who asked the question, but I'm going to assume that this person is trying to avoid checkbox type DEI. We said we'd do a survey, so we did a survey and we never came back to it. Nothing really happens. Or folks maybe are starting to use the right language and yet microaggressions are still happening. So how do we get away from that? One is by doing what this question actually does, making a distinction between what is authentic, substantive, data-based sort of DEI, and stuff that's more superficial. And there are lots of reasons for why it might be more superficial than not, but just bringing awareness to that is really important. And I often say to folks, in your job, you probably know how to do this, whether you are a financial person and you crunch numbers, or you are a teacher and you have to assess your students, or you are a musician and you have to figure out if you're ready for your actual performance. You know how to get to excellent. We need to figure that out for our DEI aspirations as well. When do we know we've gotten to excellent? Another comment question, how do you know what to do, or if and when there is a moment of needing to agree or disagree? One person feels something is perpetuating white supremacy, for example, celebrating Columbus Day, and another feels that it is not. Great question. And here I emphasize the term white supremacy. I did that because, similar to what I was saying earlier about the language that we use, and again, I have no truck with the term white supremacy. I understand what it means and it has some great validity, but it's also a trigger term in some ways. I tend to talk about social identity supremacy, which for me harkens back to there but for a change of circumstance. White supremacy can, I think, trigger a sense of essentialization in the folks who are considered or consider themselves to be white identified, can easily sort of get to this feeling of, well, you're saying there's something essentially wrong with me then. I'm not a supremacist, et cetera, et cetera. And then we get into this explanation about, well, that's not exactly what we mean. Like, don't be so thin-skinned, don't be fragile, et cetera, et cetera. And if that's a conversation that folks want to have, I think that's great. But I think it can get in the way of acknowledging, for example, that Columbus Day venerates a really bad thing that happened in the history of our planet, right? And in saying that, I didn't say anything about anybody's race or even where they come from, right? But there was conquest, there was savage invasion, and who knows where the world would be if it hadn't happened. So is this really something we should be celebrating? And that's an open question. It's an argument in a way, obviously, but it's not me saying that because you look like Columbus, you must be a bad person. So the language that we use when we talk about these things can be really important. I hope that few people would disagree with the facts that I just stated about what Columbus Day is about. And once we agree on the facts, then we can at least together try to reckon with what do we do now, which is why many organizations and certainly many schools are moving away from celebrating that time of the year as something called Columbus Day. There are times when people feel like an action is not inclusive and others do not see it the same way. How can leadership hold people accountable in times like this? That's a beautiful question. Accountability is huge here, and obviously I emphasize that. Again, I ask us to think about our competencies and practices when it's not in the DEI realm, right? We know what it is to hold somebody accountable for harassment, for stealing property, for coming in late over and over again. We understand what those markers are, and if you cross that line, something's going to happen. We need to get as close to that as we can for DEI as well. There's an interesting, I think, sort of overlap that hasn't yet been worked out between DEI and HR, right? HR is usually for the capital letter stuff, capital H harassment, capital D discrimination. DEI tends to focus on sort of sub-threshold HR stuff, microaggressions, exclusion, et cetera, et cetera. What are our standards for those sub-HR things, and how does HR work with DEI to clarify that, to train to it, and then to hold people accountable? It seems to me that some efforts at building inclusivity can also be experienced as pressure to join social and informal activities, both on and off the clock. For example, team lunches or outings may be intended to build team cohesion and personal relationships, but can be alienating to those who prefer a brighter line between work and life. Best ways to navigate, tools for understanding team in this way? Great question. Sometimes in our zeal, and I mean that in a positive way, to build positive culture, we come up with programs that we think everybody should do because this will bring us all together. Paradoxically, that can ignore the diversity within a group. Not all of us are drinkers. Not all of us like going out in large groups. Is there a way to try to tailor some of these events, so that all different kinds of people will have a place to go to make connections in a way that feels sufficiently comfortable and meaningful for them? And I think, again, that takes time and effort versus the one size fits all, but I do think the outcomes are better. Often the impetus for DEI efforts come from staff asking the leaders of an organization to focus more attention on this. But in many nonprofit environments, leadership is stretched too thin to give it the full attention it deserves. What examples have you seen or approaches do you recommend for organizational leaders to actually devote the time and energy to lead on this? Another great question. Leadership being too stretched, you see emphasized there, and then examples and approaches. I started supporting a place called the Crest Collaborative, which is a consortium of programs for students who are faced with a range of different disabilities. Super busy place, as you can imagine. A lot goes on there every day that needs sort of on-the-spot attention. One of the first things we did, and I'm just there a few hours a week as a consultant, so I can't be the capacity, but one of the first things we did is form a diversity hiring committee, because people were asking, how can we make this place a bit more representative of our clientele? And one way is to put resources towards it, but it wasn't going to be the DEI guy. It was a representative group of diverse faculty who were willing to do this work. So we trained them, we talked about it. That thing got up and running in just a few weeks, and it's been a wonderful boon to that organization. I use that, and I could tell other stories, but I use that as a way to say that when our staff is strong enough and good enough to say to the leaders, we need help with DEI, I think it's natural for a leader to say, oh my gosh, what can I do? But the first thing we can do is empower others to do the work. And this is really important to me, make sure they're acknowledged for it. It shouldn't be now you have two jobs, right? But if you do have the energy for this, let's find a way to make it practicable for you to do it. And let's make sure that you're compensated one way or the other for it. And this may be the last one, and then I'll see if we have time for live questions. Our racial justice planning group has been working for several years in our congregation to raise awareness of how we can become truly a multicultural, inclusive, and anti-racist community. While a few years ago, we voted to fly a BLM flag and adopted a statement of conscience, we still have trouble bringing folks together for conversation. They resist with so many reasons. I should have also emphasized the word voted here. As with so many things in organizations, not everybody's going to be satisfied or even agree with it. But once the organization takes a stance, it's a performance expectation. Everybody aligns with that. And I don't know exactly how this one played out, obviously. But if the organization, has made a determination, hopefully with good input from everybody, that we are going this way and not that way. Sorry, those of you who want to go that way. And and people are still resisting that. That to me is a performance issue. It's not about me trying to convince you anymore. It's about me reminding you, this is what it means to work here, right? And if you're not working here, just as if you were, again, coming in late every morning, that is a problem. It's not a discussion about whether or not you have a right to do it. That may sound draconian from a guy who you're probably picking up as pretty easygoing, but I think it's really important sometimes to draw some lines. Two quick ones. How can we best get our board to represent our organization? First of all, that's crucial. These things, I hope in your PDF, should be linked to these documents that you see here should have live links for you. Getting the board on board is a wonderful document about how boards can and must contribute to and take a real live part in DEI processes. Making the hidden visible is a wonderful report on what it's like to be a DEI practitioner and how important it is to make sure that they have support. And avoiding racial equity detours is just what it says. The things that just happen, that get in the way of really making progress. And then I'm glad this came up, microaggressions. There is more and more good material out there these days about understanding microaggressions, responding to them, and getting people on the same page about them. And I won't go into details now. Instead, I'll notice that we're sort of within 10 minutes, and I will open up my thing here so I can see my friends and ask, Dennis and Dora, have we collected any questions that you would like to sort of share with me in the last few minutes? And I'll open the chat too to see what I can find there.
There's been a couple of comments, if you can see them in the chat. If not, I can read them out to you.
I can see them.
Okay.
I'm happy to start at the top and just go down in the time we have. Does that make sense? Unless you saw one that you thought, Carlos, please jump to that now.
Nope, there's.
All right, so thank you, Liz, for doing what you said. Rachel offered, hello there. Oh, I'm so glad you raised this. Thank you. I just want to share some feedback I've received from people who identify as having a disability and don't like the term blind spot or similar expressions, term blind eye, et cetera, et cetera. These expressions use being blind to convey something negative. It uses blindness or low vision to describe, et cetera, et cetera. So I meant to talk about this when I did this. That document that you have that uses blind spot is something I think about constantly. And as you can see, I'm still using it. My sort of research, and both in terms of literature and what I can find online and articles, and in talking to people who self-identify as one way or another being part of a community that experiences vision impairment, really goes back and forth. There's great diversity is what I've discovered in those dialogues. When blind is used clearly, as a derogation, for example, when an umpire is called blind as a bat, yikes, that's an insult. On the other hand, if blind actually means to not be able to see something, then it's more or less a neutral term. And there's ocular physical blindness, obviously, and we shouldn't have any trouble with that, it seems to me. Just as when I'm driving, there's a blind spot, in my side view mirror that I should be aware of. That's just a fact. It's not a negative. Cognitively, there's things we can't see as well. There was a wonderful book written a few years ago. I'm looking at my bookshelf to the right. That's why you're seeing me doing this, called The Blind Spot, which was about implicit bias. And obviously the authors of that book certainly weren't meaning anything negative by it. They're actually trying to mark something that's real in terms of a cognitive perceptual thing that is going on or not going on for some of us. So I leave it to you, as you are sorting out your terminology. For me, I'm still using it, and I try to be really careful to say that I'm very thoughtful about why I use it this way. That might change for me as time goes on. And that's one of the most interesting and I think challenging aspects of doing DEI work as well. What is inclusive, to whom, when, and how? So thank you for bringing that up. The reframing of anti-racism and other isms as anti-bias is an interesting concept for how to build coalitions, but isn't there an issue in it not calling out specific isms that can be swept up in the dominant group's attempt to address anti-bias in a one-size-fits-all approach? And I think this is part of the same question, so I'll read it too. How can we build coalitions around anti-bias while also giving each specific area of tension the time it needs? That is the challenge, and I would say that's the opportunity, right? There is a very good reason, for why things are dealt with a this thing now sort of approach, because it's a lot, to be being fired at, and also to think, how can I reach out to those other folks as well, but I do contend, suggest, promote that the more we can do the both and, the better things are going to get for everybody. So again, is there a risk that, folks might use the anti-bias, sort of banner to not attend to things that are most on fire? I would say there could be, but I think the sort of response to that is we have the metrics, right? Yes, everybody is susceptible to facing bias. What's happening in our community right now? If it turns out that folks who are in a certain demographic are suffering, statistically, in more areas than not, compared to other groups, COVID, for example, then we ought to be giving differential attention to those folks. Again, if it were a school setting, it's equity versus equality, right? Everybody should be treated equally, but in order to do that, we have to apply equity principles and give folks what they need so that they can have as much as everybody else. So I think that's the both and solution to that. Inez, if I'm saying your name right, You wrote, "Hi, thank you for this. I would like to ask a question. I don't know if I see the question. Please feel free to type it in if you can in the time we have, and I'd love to hear it. In the meantime, Sandy, you said, Carlos, you mentioned data on the way to measure DEI work. What sort of data are you thinking of and how do you collect it?" Great question. So I'm a big proponent of quantitative and qualitative data, maybe in all things, but certainly when it comes to DEI. I do think that hearing from folks and having them contribute their own subjective bearing on how they're doing is key, especially around things like belonging. That can come through sort of just narratives, how are you feeling on a particular day and at a particular time. It can come through Likert scales, that then give us some baselines that we can work from. When I was at, the last time I was full-time at a school, we did our first ever belonging assessment for kids from K through 8th grade, and that gave us a baseline from grade to grade, across demographics, across topics, even across teachers, to tell you the truth. And from there we go up. Right? Now we know some things that we have to target and we work from there. So the question for and I'm speaking to everybody individually now, particular nonprofit is, what would make most sense for you? What's the best, most meaningful and manageable way to establish that baseline, right? That then you can sort of build on from there. Rachel offered, I've had folks say that they don't like the word impairment either. This collaborative that I work at, we're in the process of doing our next strategic plan. So we're actually revamping our mission. And we've had a lot of wonderful discussion about whether or not and how to use the word disability. Because every student that we work with, one way or the other, is technically qualified as having a disability. But disability can cut so many different ways for so many different people. And within, again, the community of folks who might self-identify as disabled, there's a diversity of feelings about it. And what I tend to counsel, for my colleagues at Crest and elsewhere is we have to land somewhere. And when we do land there, I think the best we can do sometimes is to explain to folks that we've been as thoughtful as we can. We've looked in the literature. We've talked to folks who actually represent, some of these concerns. And we landed on this for this reason, whether it means we're not using disability or we are using disability, or there's something else that we've come up with. Great questions. And I'm sorry I'm not giving you this is the absolute right answer to things, because often in life that's not the case. And certainly when we're talking about inclusivity, that's a hard thing to do. I don't think inclusivity can mean, even though this might be a downer of a thing to say, that 100% of the people are satisfied 100% of the time. But what it can mean is that we did our darndest to make sure that everybody's voice was heard, so that whatever decisions we had to make to keep our organization going and doing its good work, were as informed as possible. With that, I know it's 2:00. Thank you, Bob, for saying thank you. Thank you all for listening to me. It's a lot of talking. I would love for things to be a bit more interactive, but I hope some of the stuff that was put on your plate can be adopted, if it's fine just the way it is for your settings, or adapted, ADAP, etc., to make it useful for you. And I'm always willing to hear from folks. If there's something I can do quickly to help your thinking towards building your own capacity to be ready to create an inclusive environment. And I thank you again for doing this tough work in the nonprofit sphere.
Well, thank you so much, Carlos. I have to say, for me, it's been an absolute privilege to have the opportunity to hear, based on long experience, your analysis, recommendations, framing. Going to take a while to process it all, but it's really been wonderful. So thank you on behalf of all of us.
Well, it's an honor. So thank you, Dennis and Dora, and everybody who showed up. If you go to my website, it's not the cleanest website in the world these days. I need my son to help me clean it up these days. But you can probably find some resources to go a little bit deeper than we had a chance to here. And if you don't find something there, just send me an email. I'll do my very best to get back to you.
Thank you again.
All right, folks. Hope you have a great afternoon.
Okay, just a few closing words.